Hi and welcome to the channel. I'm Laura Miller and I make videos about programming. Today we'll cover arrays and there is a lot we need to talk about, so let's switch directly to the agenda and let's start working. Let's get started right away because the agenda for today is relatively long. So we'll start by talking about how to create and clear arrays. We then talk about how to use the spread operator in the array context. We talk briefly about multidimensional arrays, how to remove elements from arrays. We then talk about specific methods for iterating over arrays and also for transforming arrays. We move on to talking about sorting and we finish with some additional useful methods for arrays. First one, let's create a new file here and I'm going to call this creating.js. There are a few ways we can create arrays. The first one is, I'm going to call this from literal, like so, and it's simply by using these square brackets here. Once I use these square brackets, then I have an array. One way of checking that is to simply console.log from literal instance of, remember the operator array, like so. If I save this, then this should output true. Let's come here to the console and let's run node creating.js, and that's true. Right, so this is an array and we can work with it. We can also have we can also use a constructor. So from constructor, and this is simply by calling the new array like so. And here the IDE is suggesting for me that I can shorten this up, and it's basically by using this square bracket. So this is another way of creating an array. And the interesting thing here is that if I pass a number as an argument to this constructor, this is going to create an array with this number of elements, and all the elements are going to be empty, right? They're going to be undefined. So let's say I want to create an array with a fixed length, a length of 10. Once I pass the 10 here to this new array constructor, then the from constructor variable is going to have an array of length 10. Let's give it a try. From constructor.length, and we could iterate over all the elements, but just for the sake of demonstration purposes here, let's print the first one and the second one. So the element at index 0 and the element at index 1. Let's save this here at the console. We're going to run this and you see that we have an array of length 10 and that both the first elements, they are undefined. Another way that we can create arrays and actually fill these arrays with a certain value is by using the .fill method. So here I'm going to call from fill, and this is going to be a new array. And again of length 10, and I'm going to pass a method. I'm going to call the method fill. Now this method, ideally we should use only with primitive values, and we will see in a bit what can happen if we use object values. But let's then, just for the sake of demonstration, console.log from fill like so, and then here back at the console let's run node creating.js, and we will see that we will have an array of 10 elements, all of them pointing to 1. I mean, not pointing to 1, but with the value 1. Now, if I were to actually use a non-primitive type here, for example, an object, now this will work. It's going to fill the array with this object, but every element of the array is going to be pointing to the same object. Remember that non-primitive values, they are assigned and compared by reference, and here all the elements of the array are assigning or are pointing to the same element behind the scenes. It's easier to demonstrate this with an example. Let's come here and say that from fill we want to modify the first element and we want to set the name equals to Jane. Now what's going to happen here is that this change is going to affect every single element of the array, not just the first one. Let's copy the console.log here at the bottom and let's see what happens. And as you can see, every single element was modified. Of course, this is not desirable, at least in 99.9% of the cases. We don't want to have something like this. So we need to use another way for filling arrays with values which are not primitive values. Luckily for us, there is such a method and it's called a from method. So here I'm going to name this constant from, and this is going to be, we're going to use array.from. The from method receives 1 or 2 arguments, and the first argument that we always need to pass is an array-like object. So how does an array-like object look like? Well, if I enter into the definition file of this from method, and this comes from TypeScript, when we talk about TypeScript, everything here is going to become much clearer. But for our purposes, let's just have a look at the type of this array-like parameter. If I click here on array-like, then you will see that an array-like object has a length property, and it has an index or several indexes, which are numbers, and then they point to a certain value. This can be a primitive or a non-primitive value. And here in TypeScript, this is a generic, right? So this T here is a generic value, which means, well, we don't know yet, we don't know in advance what is going to be the actual type of these objects or of these values here in JavaScript. Now, the important thing is that it has to have this length property. If I come back here to creating and I pass a length here, and then I can pass just any number, 5 for example, this is going to create an array of length 5. Let's now console.log the from, and we'll see that all the elements, I believe they're going to be undefined. So let me clear everything. Here I think I can actually just remove a few of this. Now let's save and let's execute this again. And then exactly we have an array with 5 undefined values. Now we have a second possibility for the array.from method, and this possibility is to pass a second argument here, which is a function. The function is going to be used to generate the values of the array. If I were to pass, for example, a function that returns 1, this is going to fill the array with the primitive value 1. Once I save this and I execute the code, you'll see that it's filled with ones. Now, if I were to return an object here, now this is also going to fill the from array with objects, but they are not going to be all the same. I'm going to save this and you see 5 objects here. But now if I modify the first one, so from 0.name is equal to Jane, this is going to impact only the first element. Once I save this and I run this again, you will see that only the first element is changed. This is normally the desired behavior in 99.9% of the cases, so keep that in mind. We can use this method here, array.from, if we need to create an array of a fixed length with a non-primitive value. Let's see how we can clear up arrays. So I'm going to create a new file here. I'm going to call this clearing.js, and I'm going to create a basic array here. So basic is going to be 1, 2, 3, right? So just an array with 3 elements, the numbers 1, 2, 3. Don't confuse this with the indexes. This first one is index 0, the second one is index 1, and the third one is index 2. But here the values are going to be 1, 2, 3. Now I'm going to create another array, let's say array 1 or basic 1. Basic 1, and this is going to also point to basic. And basic 2, this will also point to basic. Now actually here, let me use the let keyword because I will probably modify this, or for some of them I'll modify, for others I'm gonna change the properties, but here just for the sake of demonstration, let's leave everything as let. Rule of thumb would be, well, you would use const as much as possible and you would fall back to let only if const is not enough, only if you really need to change the value of the variable. There are 2 main ways of clearing arrays. The first one is to reassign this variable here, for example, the basic 1, to an empty array. This is going to simply reset basic 1 to an empty array, and it's not going to affect the basic variable. And the second way of doing that, and let's do that with basic 2, is to simply modify the length property and set it equals to 0. So this here does not modify basic. And this one here, it does modify, so maybe modifies basic. And this is because here we are assigning 0 to a property length, but because basic 2 is actually assigned by reference because it's a non-primitive value, then this dot length here is also affecting the original basic array. Let's give it a try and let's say console.log. So before here, I'm gonna add another console.log just to show that it does not modify the basic array. So console.log basic 1, and this will still output 2. And here I'm going to console.log basic 1, but now this one is going to output undefined. I'm going to save this, and here I'm going to clear the whole thing. I'm going to run node clearing.js. And as you can see, the first one outputs 2 correctly, the second one outputs undefined. Now, well, I tend to prefer the first one, right? So the first one for me makes more sense because the second one is a little bit cryptic in terms of what it is exactly doing, and we can have side effects which are undesired. Okay, now that we have a better idea of how to create and clear arrays, let's move on to talking about the spread operator in the context of arrays. I'm going to create a new file here, and I'm going to call this spread.js. The spread operator can be used in the context of arrays to copy all the values from one array into another array. So let's say this is going to be my first array, and I'm going to have a couple of letters here, A, B, B and C. And now I want to create a second array, which is going to have all the elements of the first array plus a couple more elements. So if I use the spread operator like so, and then I can add here 1, 2, 3, for example, once I console.log the second, then this is going to print ABC 1, 2, 3. Back here at the editor, at the console, let's clear and run node spread.js. Then you see that we actually copied the values. Now, the same thing with that we discussed in objects, it also applies to the context of arrays. This copy here is a shallow copy, which means that if I have an object, let's here say that we have something with a name, and this is going to be called Lauro. And in the second here, we have an array. Let's say that we have again another array with X, Y, X, Y, and Z. Once I use the spread operator, I can still console.log the second here, is no problem. It's gonna console.log things correctly. But if I modify the elements of second, if I modify the array or the object, accessing it via the second variable, this will also modify the elements from the first variable. And that's because, again, assignment happens by reference, so both of them will be pointing to the same place. Let's give it a try. If I were to come here and say second, and then the array is in the first index, so second first, and then I can try to access, or even better, let's try to push a new object here, or a new element. Let's try to push then capital letter X. Once I do that, and then I console.log first, this should now show here X, Y, Z, and then the capital X or uppercase X letter in the end. Let's save this and let's run it again. As you can see, it is here already also in the first variable. If I were to do the same with the object, so if I were to access it via the second variable and then the object here, and I set the age, for example, to, I don't know, 10, and then if I were to console.log first, this will also show the updated object. Same advice is valid here. Just be careful when you are working with non-primitive values, and the spread operator, this shallow copy and this assignment by reference, they can be really tricky and can lead to very hard to debug bugs. That's it for now about spread operators. Let's talk about multidimensional arrays. And in JavaScript, to be honest, there are no multidimensional arrays. If I were to create here multi.js, the multidimensional arrays, they are simply arrays whose elements are arrays. So multi, this I could say this is an array, and then it has 1, 2, 3, and then another array 4, 5, 6, and then another array here 7, 8, 9. And this is a matrix, a 3 by 3 if you want to call it, but behind the scenes there is nothing different. It's just an array which has its elements as arrays, and you can nest as much as you want. There are no special methods to handle multidimensional arrays. If I just console.log multi here, it's nothing different. It's probably just going to run output it nicely, or not enough elements to output it nicely. But there are no specific methods, there are no specific optimizations going on behind the scenes. Multidimensional arrays are simply nested arrays, and you can use array methods to access the individual elements of the outer arrays, and then again use array methods to access the elements of the inner arrays. Now, if you want to get rid of these nested arrays, then one nice method that you can use is to call the .flat method. If I save this now and back here at the console I execute, then you will see that they will be all at the same level. Now, if I have again here a nested array, so 2 and then another nested array, let's say, I don't know, 100, and I save this, then the flat is going to eliminate only the first depth, only the first level here. Once I run this, then you will see that the nested arrays, they are still arrays here in the result. If I pass another depth here, for example, if I pass an argument of number 2, then let's see what happens, and then you see that it removes the second level of this nested arrays. If I pass a further depth of depth 3, for example, and I run, then all of them are at the same level. And if I pass something even higher, then nothing happens because there are no additional nested arrays here. Quick discussion about multidimensional arrays, really nothing special in JavaScript. Let's move on to talking about removing elements from arrays. New file here, and this is going to be removing.js. There are 4 main ways for us to remove elements from arrays. The first one is to use the .shift method, and this is destructive, which means it modifies the original array. The second one is to use the pop method. This is also destructive. We then have another method which is a little bit more complex, which is the splice method. This is also destructive. And we have the rest operator, which is non-destructive. Let's go through each of them. Maybe here I can take this multi-element, or actually no, that's too complex here. Let's say basic here, and I'm gonna say 10 elements, 9 elements, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So the .shift method is going to modify the basic, and what it's going to do, it is going to remove the first element and it's going to return it, and it's going to leave the remaining objects, the remaining elements in the basic array. Once I execute basic.shift and then I console.log basic, then you will see that it has now only 8 elements. Let's come here to the console. I'm going to clear everything and run node removing.js. The element 1 is gone, and now we have just 2 until 9. Now, if I were to console.log the basic.shift here, we will see that it's going to print 1 on the screen, and that's because shift returns the element that is removed from the array. If I execute this, here is the 1. The second method we can use is the pop method, and the pop method is similar to the shift method in the way that it also modifies the array, but now it does not remove the first element, it removes the last element. So here, if I were to execute basic.pop, then this is going to remove the element 9 and it's going to return it here. Basic. It's going to return here. And once I console.log, or once I log the basic array, then it's going to be from 1 up to 8. Let's save this, and then here let's execute this again, and we will see that's exactly what happens. The splice method is a little bit more complex than the other 2 ones, and it works like so. So I'm gonna write it here, basic.splice, and the splice method has to receive at least 1 argument, so let's say 2. And this defines the start from which I am going to start cutting my array. If I simply execute it like so, let's see here, it is going to remove every element starting from the index 2 up to until the end of the array, right? So remember here, this is index 0, this is index 1, and this is index 2. So it starts at index 2 and goes until the end of my array. If I pass an additional argument to the splice method, let's say 5, this is going to be the delete count. So it's going to start at index 2 here with the element 3, and then it's going to remove 5 elements, so 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. If I save this, so the other ones, the final 2 ones, they're going to be left in the array. And if I save this and execute, then you will see here are my 5 removed elements, and here is my resulting array. I can still pass more arguments to my splice method, and any additional argument that I pass here, it is going to be added to my array starting at the position where I removed the item. So let's say that I'm passing here A and B. So let's save this and let's see what happens. Once I execute this, you will see that it added the A and B elements to my array in the place where it removed my 5 elements. Now, of course, here I didn't pass 5 elements and my IDE is complaining because it thinks that this array here is of type number, and that makes sense. If I were to, for example, do something like this, then it stops complaining because now the array contains numbers and strings. This is due to TypeScript. We will understand this when we talk about TypeScript. But for here, maybe I can just do it like so, and that's no problem. So any additional argument that I pass to my splice function, or my splice method, is going to be added to my array. If I pass an object, for example, and then here the case is the same, the IDE is complaining because there are no objects here. So if I pass another object here, then it stops complaining. And once I execute, then we will see that we have the object here. If I just want to add elements starting from a certain index, then I can pass a delete count of 0, for example, and this is not going to remove anything, and it's going to add A and B starting from index 2. Let's save this and let's see what happens, and there it is. We have 1, 2, and then in the index 2 it added A and B, and then we continue with our array 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Adding elements to an array starting at a specific index can be useful in some cases, so at least you know that it's possible by using this method. Just keep in mind that the splice method modifies the original array, so if the original array is used somewhere else, you need to be careful when executing the method. The last possibility for removing elements from an array is by using the rest operator. And the rest operator we already discussed before. Let's use here the array syntax. This is going to use destructuring, and here this is going to be equal to basic. Now I can access, starting from the beginning of the array, I can access the elements, right? So I can say first, second, and then let's say here in the end, I want to have all the other elements, so others. Now the first one, let me just console.log everything. Console.log first, console.log second, console.log others. Like so. Let's save this, and back here let's clear the whole thing and run node removing.js, and that's exactly the expected behavior. Now let's say that I want to simply remove the first 3 elements of my array. I don't want to modify it, but I'm not interested in the value of these 3 first elements. One possibility for us here is to simply omit the name of these variables so they don't exist anymore. And now I have ignored the first argument here, or the first element here, the second element here, and now if I want to ignore the third element, then I do something like this, and then the others is going to contain from 4 up to 9. If I run this here, we'll see from 4 up to 9. So this is one method that can be useful. I find it more useful whenever I need to access a specific element of the array, or when I want to destructure only the first or only the second elements. But in any case, this can be used to actually remove elements from the array without really modifying the basic array. If I were to console.log basic here, you will see that basic is still the same. It's still from 1 to 9. That's it for removing elements. Let's talk about iterating over arrays. So new file, iterating.js. I want to talk about 3 methods here: the find index, and the filter. So find and find index are quite similar. All of them here, they receive callbacks as arguments, and let's see how they behave. The first one is the find. So let's, again here, I will copy from removing, and I'm going to paste this here. The first one is the find method, and the find method receives a callback. So let's see here, result is going to be basic.find, and then here I can pass a callback, and the callback receives the element in the first position, and it receives the index in the second position. And then I can use this to actually perform some evaluations here within my function and return something that is then going to be coerced to a boolean, and the find is going to return the first element for which this boolean value is true. If there are no elements in the array, then the find is going to return undefined. So for example, if I were to simply work with the element itself and say element is greater than 10, this res here is going to be undefined. So console log res. Let's now save this and run in the console. So node iterating.js, then this is going to be undefined. If I were to say element is greater than 4, for example, this is going to print 5, and that's because it's coercing the 5 to being a number. And here, if I were to say type of element is equal to string, like so, then this is going to return the 5 as well. If I were to run this, this is going to return the 5. The find index method is very similar to the find method, but there are two differences. The first one is that it returns the index instead of returning the element. And here as well, it's for the first element which matches or for which the callback returns a truthy value. And if there is no such element, it returns -1 instead of returning undefined. Let's say here, for example, that I write symbol, so type of element is symbol. And because I have no symbols in my array, then once I try to run this in the console with iterating.js, I get -1 as the response. If I were to pass here a new symbol, so symbol, for example, like so, then this is going to return the index of my symbol here. I'm going to save this and I'm going to execute. I get as a result 9, right? So 9 is the index here because I have 10 elements. I start at 0, so it varies from 0 to 9. The filter method is going to return an array containing all the elements for which the return value of the callback is a truthy value. Let me remove the symbol here and let's convert this back to a number just to avoid any errors being thrown by JavaScript. And if I were to execute this, so passing the callback element and then element module 2 is equal to 0, for example, this is going to return all the even values, all the even numbers from my array. If I were to run with node iterating.js, then I get as a result 2, 4, 6, and 8. Of course, here the function can be more complex, but it has to return a value. Okay, that is the important part of the callback function. But for any of these methods, if the callback function does not return any value, if I were to simply console.log here, okay, that's nice. I would get a bunch of console.logs, but this because it does not return any value behind the scenes, it returns undefined. And as we know, undefined is a falsy value, and therefore it's going to be false for every single element of the array. So the filter is going to be empty, right? If I were to execute this, I get an empty array in the end. And that's because it returns undefined, and undefined is always false for JavaScript. If I want to simply go over each element of the array and do something with that, there are a couple of ways we can do it. We discussed in the loops section that we can use the for loop. So for let I equal 0, I less than basic.length, and then here we have I++. Then I can do something here with each element of my array within this loop, right? So if I were to say const element is equal to basic I, then here I can do something with it. So console.log element, for example. If I save this and run here iterating.js, then I will just execute, I will print every element on the screen. Of course, there is a shorter version for this, and it is to use the for off loop. So const element of basic, then I can simply console.log the element on the screen, and that's going to be the exact same behavior. You can find in some places that you are using that you find the for each loop. And to be honest, the for each I think is less optimal than the for off. Okay, it's a little bit slower. There are some other issues with the for each loop. So whenever you need to iterate over an array, my suggestion is to use the for off loop. It's more concise than the basic for loop, and it's more efficient than the for each method. Okay, now that we are done talking about iterating over arrays, let's talk about transforming arrays. I'm just going to delete this. Let's create a new file here, and this is going to be transforming.js. I want to talk about two functions here. The first one is the map function and the second one is the flat map. Now there is another function, I'll just mention it here. It's the reduce function, and this function is a little bit more advanced in its usage. I'm not going to cover it here, but feel free to go and do some research about it and try to understand how it works by playing with some examples you can find online. So let's go through the map and the flat map functions. I'm going to copy the array from the iterating file. I'm going to paste this here, and then I'm going to just change a couple of signs here, negative, negative, and negative. And what the map function does, it receives a callback, and the flat map also receives a callback. So both of these functions, they are going to go through each element of the array. It's going to apply the callback, and then the return value of the callback function is going to be the value of this element in a new array that is then returned by the map or the flat map functions. Now, the difference between map and flat map is that map returns a single value and flat map also works if we return an array of values. Now, the difference is perhaps a little bit fluid. It's not as clear cut as we would want it to be, but let's explore each of them in detail. So first example, let's say that I want to remove the negative, so no negatives, and then I will iterate over the basic array by calling the map method and passing a function, or passing a callback. This callback can receive three arguments. The first one is the element, the second one is the index, and the third one is the original array in case we need to access this original array from within the callback. Now we could do some checks, we could do some filtering here, for example, but for our purposes, we will just use the element. If the element is greater than 0, then we will simply return the element, otherwise we are going to return 0. What this is going to do is for each 0 or negative number, it's going to substitute this number by 0, this number by 0, and this number by 0, but the other ones, which are positive, they are going to be returned as they are. Let's now console.log no negatives. And if I run here node transforming.js, then you will see that all the negative numbers were substituted by 0. Another example is that I can try to, let's say, calculate the doubles of all the elements in the no negative. So no negatives.map element, and then here I'll simply return element times 2. And this is going to be then used here. If I print this on the screen, then all the elements are going to be twice as what they used to be. So the map function can be quite useful if we need to go over an array and then apply some transformation to each of the elements. Now for the flat map, let's change this a little bit and let's change to an array of strings. So John says hello. And what we want to do here is we want to split this up and return only the characters. We're not interested in the words anymore, but we just want the characters. If I were to use the map function, so characters, here I would say basic.map, then element, and then element.split with an empty string here. This is going to split each word into its characters, and it's going to return this to me. Let's console.log this on the screen and let's see which result we get. Once I save this and run this here, we actually get an array with nested arrays. Now, if I want to remove the nested arrays and simply return all the characters, I could call this characters.flat. Yes, that is true. That could be done. And then this is going to return only the characters. But I can have a shortcut here, and instead of calling map, I can call flat map. Now the flat map also receives a callback, but if it returns an array, it's going to flatten this array while returning the value of the methods or the new array from the flat map. So now, as you can see, it's going to do exactly what we want. It's going to return only the characters, and it does both steps of iterating over the array, applying the callback function, and then flattening whatever result is returned from that function. Check methods for transforming array. Let's talk about sorting arrays. And well, maybe you think that JavaScript is smart enough, for example, to sort numbers in an ascending or in a descending order by default, but that's not really the case. If we call the sort method without any type of argument, it's going to sort the elements of the array based on their string representation. And this is very, very rarely the behavior that we actually want. So let's see how this works. Here I can copy these numbers. So for example, here I have some numbers, and let's go a little bit beyond here. That's going to be -4. It's going to be -50, for example. And then here we can have 60, 72, 1.8, and then 900. Right? So as you can see, the numbers here, they have some different order, but they have actually we could want, or we definitely would want at some point to order them either in an ascending order or descending order. Let's see what happens if I simply call console.log basic.sort. If I don't pass any function here and I then come here to the console and I run node sorting.js, then you will see that it actually, it has no actual order. Basically, the order here is that it is ordering according to the string representation of the numbers. The minus comes before, then there is the 1, then it comes 2, 3, 6, 7, and 9. So you can see we cannot rely on the sort method by default to order numbers, but the sort method receives a function, receives a callback that then, depending on the returned value, this is going to actually sort the array. And the callback function works like so. It receives two parameters, a and b, and then if we return, then here I'm going to write as a comment, if we return a negative value, then a is considered to be smaller than b. If we return 0, from the function, then a is considered to be equal to b. If we return a positive value, I think you can guess what happens, then a is considered to be greater than b. So if we wanted to order this array in an ascending order, we can simply return a minus b, right? So a minus b is going to be negative if a is smaller than b, is going to be 0 if a is equal to b, and it's going to be positive if a is greater than b. We could actually do a more explicit version of this a minus b here by saying if a minus b is greater than 0, return 1, else if a minus b strictly equal to 0, return 0, else, and then here we know for sure that, well, at least we are assuming we are working with numbers, else return -1, right? So if I were to have the code like this, and then here I can already console.log this on the screen, then I execute, now I have it ordered correctly from smallest to largest. Now, if I were to simply remove this whole thing and return, or actually here I don't even need a return, I can simply say a minus b, then this is going to perform the exact same sorting. If I were to switch and write b minus a here, then this is going to order the whole thing in a descending order. If I save this and then I run, now you can see that 900 is the first element and -50 is the last element. One cool thing of this feature, or of passing a callback to the sort function, is that we can actually sort an array of objects. Let's try to have 3 objects here. I'm just gonna write this up a little bit. And the first name is going to be John, and John is gonna have an age of 30. And then the second element here, and we're gonna have a second and a third element, is gonna be Jane, and Jane is gonna be 27. And the third one is going to be Max, and Max is going to be 40. Now, if I want to order this, or if I want to sort this array based on the age of each object, then I can actually have, sorry, here the IDE is populating these things and it's a little bit hard to read. But the idea here is that I have the A is my first object and B is my second object. And then I can simply say return A.age minus b.age. This is going to sort the array based on the age property of the objects in an ascending order. Now we should see Jane in the first position, John in the second, and Max in the third position. If I execute this, that's exactly the output that I get on the screen. Now, one important note is that the sort method, it modifies the array. So if I were to console.log basic here, and I'm going to remove the console.log statement here for not to be confusing. If I were to console.log basic, this is going to print the modified. This is going to print the sorted array. Let's save this and run it here. As you can see, it's exactly the same as before. So be careful when calling the sort method because it will change the original array. It is a quote-unquote destructive method in the sense that it mutates the original array that is calling the method. Done covering the main aspects of sorting arrays, let's finish with discussing a couple of additional methods that can be useful in some specific situations when working with arrays. I'm gonna create a new file here. I'm gonna call this additional.js, and the 5 methods I want to discuss here with you is the keys method, the entries method, the every method, the sum method, and the includes method. Let's start with the keys method, and what the keys method does in the context of arrays is that it returns all the indexes of the array. So some array here, and for the sake of being brief, let's say 1, 2, 3. If I were to console.log some array.keys, this is going to return 0, 1, and 2. Actually, let me change this to letters because the entries here may get a little bit confusing. If you are not familiar with arrays, then it can get a little bit confusing. So ABC and the keys is just going to return the indexes. Here, let's clear the whole thing and run node additional.js. And oops, as you can see, it's actually printing something weird on the screen. If I want to print this as an array, I can use a construct like so. And once I run this, then I actually get 0, 1, and 2. This is because the keys returns an iterator, and an iterator is printed like this on the screen. But if I use this array construct here with the spread operator, I can actually use this iterator and copy the values to a new array. And here I'm printing a new array on the screen. I know maybe it's a little bit complicated, not so easy to understand, but in any case, just this is one way of printing an iterator in the form of array. If I change this to entries, the entries is actually going to return pairs of index. So this here, I'm just going to write this, returns the indexes of the array. And the entries, they returns a pair or returns pairs of index and element. Okay, if I save this now, I should have 0A, 1B, and 2C. Let's run this here on the screen, and that's exactly what I get, 0A, 1B, and 2C. The .every method, it receives a callback. So it receives a callback here, same for the sum method, it receives a callback, and it is going to return true if every element of the array, or if for every element of the array, the callback returns a truthy value. And it's going to return false if for at least one element the callback returns a falsy value. And the .sum method is slightly different, that it returns true if at least one of the elements has or for the callback returns true for at least one of the elements. And this is going to return false if the callback returns false for all the elements. So I know it's a little bit confusing if I speak like this. So let's see some array dot sum, and then here I can pass a callback. So let's define 2 callbacks, and I can actually define here something like this, has number, and this is going to be equal to an element, and it's going to return element or type of element, or actually is number, not has number, but is number, and type of element is equal to number. And then here I can say is string, then element, type of element is string. Now, as you can see, I'm declaring 2 functions here. I'm assigning them to a variable called isNumber and isString, and then I can simply pass this variable like so to my as a callback. This is the same thing as copying this function and passing it here. Now, just find this is a nicer syntax because it's very easy to know what's happening, right? I'm just passing a callback here and I'm checking sum array.sum is string. So basically I'm checking if some element, if any element of my array is a string. If I save this and execute the code, then I get true because the first one is a string. If I pass is number here, then I'm going to have false because there is no number in my array. So now if I execute, I get false. But if I add a number here, now this is going to return true, right? So this is going to return true because at least one element of my array is a number. Now, if I change this to every, and then every is number, this is going to return false because there are strings, right? So if I were to now run this, I get false as a result. And if I were to pass this is string here, I also get false because now I have a number. So if I save this and execute, false again. And if I remove the number, then I get true as a result. The last method I want to cover is the includes method. And this is going to receive an element here as an argument. And it's going to check if this element is in the array. So when I erase this, and I'm going to console.log sum array.includes, sum array.includes a, that is going to print true. Just clear the whole thing, and this is going to print true. And of course, if I were to pass a new letter that is not in the array, for example E, this is going to return false. And one small, actually not small, but one detail that you need to keep in mind is that, of course, this, because non-primitive values in JavaScript are assigned and compared by reference, I cannot use the includes here to actually try to find an object. Let's say that I want to find an object which has a name of John, and I have this object here in my array. This will still not work because the reference of this object is different than the reference of this object. If I save this and I run, I still get false. The only way that we could make this work by using the includes is by having this object in another variable, person, and this is going to be named John, and then I pass the same variable here, person, and person here. If I save this, now this is going to output true, right? So just be careful here that when we have objects in our arrays, we cannot use the includes and pass a new object and expect it to find. Even if the shape, the contents of the objects are the same, this is going to return false because the comparison happens by reference. That's it for today. I know a lot of stuff to cover, a lot of stuff to understand, but don't worry about getting everything right now. Of course, you need to work with them and practice what we discussed here today so that you get a good understanding. That's why I recommend you check the online exercises for arrays, and as you know, the link is in the description of this video. In the next video, we'll talk about destructuring. If you don't want to miss that, make sure to subscribe to the channel and you will get a notification when the video is out. So I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.